Yes, a very good afternoon and thank you for keeping it NTV Uganda. My name is Romeo Busiku. Now today, Refugee Law Project in conjunction with Uganda Human Rights Commission and other stakeholders in human dignity joined the rest of the world to speak out against torture under the theme Speak Out Against Torture During and After COVID-19. Get this. Torture is an international crime against humanity. June 26th marks the moment in 1987 when Uganda ratified the UN Convention Against Torture. Also get this, torture is a rampant pandemic which occurs both in conflict and also peacetime. So the question we are asking today on NTV, is it enough to speak out against torture? Well, to answer this question and a lot more, I'm now joined by Ms. Ruth Sechindi. She's the Director of Monitoring and Inspections at the Uganda Human Rights Commission. She's not alone. I'm also joined by Ms. Patience Katenda. She's a legal officer at Refugee Law Project, School of Law, Makerere University, under the program of Access to Justice, where she advocates for the rights of the most vulnerable people in our society. They join me right now in studio. A very good afternoon, ladies. Thank you for coming to NTV. Let me start with you, Ms. Ruth Sechindi. Today is the International Day in support of victims of torture. What more can you tell us about this very, very special day?
Thank you. June 26th is a very special day in the human rights discourse because this is the day that we remember not only the proclamation of the UN General Assembly in 1997, when it proclaimed June 26th as the day where we recognize victims of torture. But the same day is also considered because in 1984, the world had had the UN Convention Against Torture coming into effect. And since then, Uganda has ratified the Convention Against Torture, which we ratified in 1987. Now, this day is important because we get to call upon the state agencies to stop acts of torture. We also call upon states that have not ratified the Convention Against Torture to ratify this very important convention. It reminds us then of our duties as the state on how we should protect citizens and everyone in our states to ensure that persons are not subjected to torture, and that we have to hold persons accountable in the event that torture is meted on citizens or any other person in a particular country. So this day then becomes very important to check the states. We check ourselves on how best we're performing and look at the excesses and the gaps that we have to fill to ensure that everyone is protected against this vice. Now, we take into consideration what has been put in the constitution now. Ugandan constitution is very interesting. It prohibits torture, and among the non-derogable rights under Article 44 is torture. And those are the few non-derogable rights that cannot be limited or taken away. And torture is one of them, is one of the four. And Article 24 specifically prohibits torture in our constitution. So we go back and look at the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. And we look at the law, that is the Prevention and Prohibition of Torture Act. And we check and look at how far we have come and how we have implemented the Prevention and Prohibition of Torture Act to ensure that every Ugandan is protected against torture in Uganda.
All right, let me also bring in Patience Katenda. She's a legal officer with the Refugee Law Project. Patience, what is torture? Break it down for my viewers who are watching NTV right now. What is torture and what are the different forms through which torture manifests?
Very much, Romeo.
All right.
Good afternoon to my fellow panelists and a good afternoon to our viewers out there today. Before I answer that question, permit me in under a minute to very briefly talk about the Refugee Law Project.
Please go ahead.
Now, the Refugee Law Project is a community outreach project of the School of Law, Makerere University. It was established in the year 1999, and our vision as the Refugee Law Project is to ensure that everyone within the jurisdiction of Uganda enjoys their human rights, irrespective of their legal status. So definitely freedom from torture is among the most fundamental human rights that we as human beings are entitled to.
Indeed.
So back to the question you asked, what is torture? I am going to define torture according to international law, but also according to our domestic law, so that we get the nexus and the difference.
Indeed.
Now, according to the United Nations Convention Against Torture, which was promulgated in 1987, in Article 1, Sub-Article 1, torture is defined as, very simply put, the intentional infliction of harm, pain, or suffering on an individual or a third party for the sole purpose of getting particular information from them. Now, this particular information has to be gotten through a particular means. And this information is usually for things like intimidation or coercion. It could be to discriminate, it could be to punish, but it could also be because the person thinks they have authority over you and they can be able to get this information from you. Now, this particular law, the international law,
yes,
limits torture in regards to criminality to public officials, so to people acting in public capacity. When you compare this with the national law, which is the Prevention and Prohibition of Torture Act of 2012, it goes ahead to interrogate this law as it is international law, but goes ahead to widen it specifically because of our jurisdiction and what was akin at the moment when this law was being made. So in here, the law says that torture, you can be held accountable for torture if you're acting in the public or official capacity, but also if you're acting in the private capacity. The reason why this was specifically put was at that time when the law was being made, we are all well aware that for close to 20 years, Uganda was ravaged by war, for instance, in the northern part of Uganda. But there have also been a series of conflicts, close to 153 conflicts in Uganda as a nation. So we needed to ensure that persons acting in their private capacity, for instance, the Lord's Resistance Army leader, Joseph Kony, in carrying out various acts of torture on the population, he wasn't acting in official capacity, but in private capacity.
Right.
So to ensure that the long arm of the law could get them and hold them accountable, we had to include persons acting in private capacity. Our law still goes ahead to include other various forms of torture that we refer to as aggravated torture that may not necessarily be in the international law. Case in point is where the torture is being committed on a person, especially a female, who becomes pregnant as a result of that torture, or who was previously pregnant. Or if it's being committed or perpetrated on a person who is under the age of 18, so that's a child, or if someone acquires HIV and AIDS. But also it's good to note that the law leaves it a bit open and says that the courts of Uganda can interpret it to see if the circumstances present at the moment perpetuate it to be aggravated torture. So very briefly, those are the two definitions of torture, well knowing that the Ugandan definition is gotten from the Convention Against Torture but widens it a bit. So I remember in your second part of the question you asked...
the different forms through which torture could manifest.
Yes. Thank you for that. So the law again, the Ugandan law in the second schedule in particular, provides for three different ways. The first one being the physical, the second one being the mental or psychological, and the third being what we call the pharmacological torture. So allow me just give a few examples under there for our viewers to be able to fully understand. Now, physical torture is usually what we see. It's usually the most common form of torture that everyone can tell. And this is very commonly used as well. So for instance, if someone has mutilation is a form of that. So if someone has a missing ear, missing upper lips, a sight which was common in occurrence with the LRA war that happened in the northern part of Uganda, most of our survivors, the people who come to our offices, when you reach out to them, you could find that they do not have upper lips or eyelids. This is as a result of physical torture. But then physical torture could also go to length where it's used in regards to sexual abuse or sexual violation of persons. So it could include what is most commonly known like rape or defilement. But in addition to that, there are instances where foreign bodies are inserted into the human genitals, and that also constitutes sexual torture. It could also include the physical genitals, for instance, the male genitals being tied onto a tree to, you know, for the sake of ensuring that this person gives us the information that the perpetrator is looking for. So those are some of the examples of physical torture. Oh, and not forgetting the most common one in the Ugandan jurisdiction, which is severe beating. This happens a lot during arrests and in detention. It could be beating of the body using gut butts, jumping on the stomach, and things like that. So the second example of torture is the mental torture. Now, this torture is very interesting because it's akin. It is not usually visible to the physical eye, but it has the same detriments, if not even further, than what the physical torture does to a person. So this could include instances where a victim is held in custody, but the threats are being put on the victim's loved ones or family.
Yes.
And they're asking you, please give us this information. If not, your wife or your mother dies. So from the look of things, they're not doing anything to your physical body, but they're actually torturing your mental person. It could also include shaming acts like forced nudity. Again, that goes to your sexuality as a human being. You're forced to maybe undress, which is very shaming, to walk in public, or they could mark your body with a sign that shows that you've been here. So all those things go ahead to psychologically torture you. Sometimes it's things that you would think are so simple, like blindfolding you, and during that process you lose track of time. You do not know if it's daytime, if it's nighttime, you don't know what date it is. So all those constitute psychological torture. And then the last form of torture is what we call the pharmacological torture. Now pharmacological torture basically means the introduction of drugs into your body to ensure that with these drugs present in you, you give us the information we require. How is it done? Many a time, they will introduce addictive drugs to the victim's body. Once these drugs are in your body, you become addicted to them. Your body doesn't function without them. So then the torturer will withdraw these drugs from you at a particular point, and then we go into what we call the withdrawal period. And in this period, you are so desperate to ensure that your body functions as it was, so that the nexus is you give us the information, we give you back the drugs so that your body can function. But then sometimes it could include things like introducing a drug into your body. For instance, during the Second World War, this was used a lot. There's a particular drug the medics would help us here. It's called methicillin or something like that. They would inject you, and then it gives you a sense of calm and peace, and you're so joyful, and in that moment you can easily have conversations or sign on to things that ordinarily you wouldn't do.
So you end up confessing to a crime you never committed.
Exactly. Or giving them information that you shouldn't probably be giving, or it's not even in your right capacity to give, things that you wouldn't do ordinarily if you didn't have these drugs induced in you. So very briefly, those are the various forms of torture, and that's the definition of torture.
Amazing. And I understand that torture is still rife in this day and age, especially in Libya. It's still happening. I'm sure you know about this. Refugees are being tortured day and night so that they could get money from their relatives. Ms. Ruth Sechindi, let's talk about the kind of allegations Uganda Human Rights Commission receives on a daily basis. What kind of allegations do you receive oftenly?
On a daily basis, we receive a wide range of complaints regarding different violations. And when you go to torture, we receive many forms of torture, and over the years we have been profiling and documenting the different forms of torture that are happening in Uganda. And if you look at the trend, the levels of cruelty of torture have toned down. Now, around 1994, 95, 96, the impunity was really high, and the levels of torture, the kind of torture we're receiving, included cutting fingers, a lot of beating, severe beating, with gun butts, a lot of kicking, including torturing persons to death. But as we have gone on, and I think it has come through partners coming forward, the Ugandan Human Rights Commission, together with the Coalition Against Torture and many other partners, Refugee Law Project, coming together to advocate against torture, and us having legislation, the Prevention and Prohibition of Torture Act, we realize that the type of torture has since changed. So right now we are seeing more hitting of the joints. There's still beating, but the cruelty has toned down. It is not as bad as it is. And we have noted also that the state agencies have come up to join the cause in condemning torture. We have seen the IGP coming out to condemn acts of torture, where he actually wrote to also the different police officers, telling them not to torture persons and indicating the provisions of the act and talking about individual liability. Now, I will not go into the forms of torture, because if I do that, I also don't want to teach people how to torture. But it's been happening, and it's best that you tell them so that they don't do it inadvertently. Yes.
Yeah.
I will not go into the gravity or the intensity of what we have seen or what we are documenting, but I can say that there's a lot of beating right now and among the cases that we have received.
During COVID-19?
Yes, during COVID-19, if you bring it into that context, we have seen the continued beating, the continued cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. And when we're talking about torture, it's not about just the act of torture. It goes hand in hand with the cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment where people are treated as animals in a degrading way, including pushing people under pickups, stepping on people like they're not human beings. Now, previously, we had cases of urinating on suspects. We have had cases of hanging people on trees or suspending them on metal or other objects just to make them confess or get information from them. Or as punishment, we have had cases of where instruments or sticks and metal have been pushed into different parts of their bodies, open parts of their bodies, where eyes have been removed, nails have been removed using pliers, and many others. But anything that someone uses to extract information or a confession from you and inflict severe pain or suffering, whether mental or psychological, that is a form of torture. Now, you cannot define and exhaust the list of torture methods because these persons are ingenious. Yeah?
And on that note, Ms. Ruth Sechindi, some people say that the end justifies the means of getting information when it comes to the end justifies the means when it comes to retrieving information from suspects. Do you agree with that statement?
No, I do not. When we look at, earlier on, I talked about the non-derogable rights, where Article 44 of the Constitution tells us that under no circumstances should any person be tortured or should a person subject another to torture, whether it's in a state of emergency, whether during war or whatever situation. There can never be justification for anyone to torture another. And under the PPTA, that is the Act itself, the Prevention and Prohibition of Torture Act, it takes it a notch further where it stipulates that any person who tortures, you cannot use that information to before a court of law. So if you torture a person to extract a confession or get information, you cannot use that information as evidence in a court of law. However, that information can be used against you to prove that you tortured someone to get information or a confession. So torture is a non-derogable, the freedom from torture is a non-derogable right, and there can be no justification for acts of torture under any situation.
Well put, Ms. Ruth Sechindi. Let me also bring in Patience Katenda. Let's talk about the same issue. Can the use of torture in intelligence gathering be justified?
The answer, very simply and rightly put, is no.
Why?
Under no circumstances. The international law, again, remember that in dealing with torture, we have laws that govern the same. So the United Nations Convention Against Torture speaks the same language with the Constitution of Uganda and with the Prohibition and Prevention of Torture Act that is in place right now. Torture is a non-derogable right. Non-derogable rights are rights that are not guaranteed by state, but are accorded to a human being on their account of being born human. So being born male or female directly guarantees us that right. So under no circumstances can it be justified at all. So the answer is very simple. No. Blunt.
And of course, Patience, the COVID-19 pandemic has expounded on so many vulnerabilities because most of the focus has been on combating COVID-19, the contraction and the spread. But then we've forgotten the victims of torture who have been grappling. Poor access to the essential services that they need. So that's what we are going to be talking about in a nutshell. The theme, it asks us to speak about torture during and after COVID-19. In your opinion, why is this important?
Thank you. It is important because speaking is usually the first step. Once we speak, we understand. We speak a common language. If I could just take us a little bit back in the instance of refugees. When refugees come into Uganda, many of them do not speak English, and English is the national language of the country. So one, they cannot interact with the locals because they do not know any local languages, but second, they can't even talk to professionals. Could be a doctor, a lawyer, or anyone because they do not know the language. So at the Refugee Law Project, in our forms of rehabilitating or empowering victims, we ensure that they speak a common language. So I then go back to why we should speak against torture in the COVID-19 pandemic. Like I started, it's the first position. But how are we going to speak this language? How are we going to make sure that everyone, someone deep down in Kamdini village can understand this, as well as someone in NTV studio right now can understand it? Let's put it out there in very simple language. Let's have illustrations. It has been said that a picture speaks 1,000 words. So let's have illustrations there to show the public that this amounts to torture. But then also, just speaking about it is not enough. We should have acts that go hand in hand with speaking. For instance, the laws are very clear. What are we doing about investigation and documentation? The law is very clear that anyone has a right to report torture once there is a suspicion of torture being committed. You have a right, whether you're the perpetrator, whether you're the victim. Of course, the perpetrator wouldn't, definitely, but whether you're the victim or you're just a passerby who's seeing or has heard of this. So how are we carrying out our investigations? How is our documentation being done? Well, knowing that if we want remedies to be gotten at the end of the day, we need to have this in order. But then also, let's take it upon each of ourselves, Romeo, Ruth, myself, the viewers out there. Let's be our neighbor's watch. Let's look at what's happening. Let's poke into where we're not supposed to be, because this is an underogable right. And remember, according to the laws that I defined earlier, it can happen in the public, but it can equally happen in the private sphere. And then in addition to that, we should all remember that the fight against torture, or speaking out against torture, is not a one-man show. We need everyone involved. So we'll need the government, we'll need government actors like the judiciary, the police, the army, but we also need the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, and the tremendous work they do. We need the civil society organizations, we need students, we need the common man, we need you, the professionals, but we need everyone. It's only if we have this on a united front that we'll be able to not only speak about torture during the COVID-19 pandemic, but after it, and hopefully one day, probably 3 years or 20 years, I can't tell, we will have a torture-free world.
Ms. Ruth Sechindi, in the news recently, police said that a police officer can be prosecuted privately if he or she commits the crime of torture. Now, we are asking, why can't such police officers be disciplined under the police disciplinary rules as opposed to being held criminally liable? Why is this important?
It is very important because Uganda criminalized torture.
Yes. And
if you look at the PPTA, that is the Act, under Section 3, it provides for individualization of crime, of the crime of torture, meaning that when an errant officer commits acts of torture, they are individually liable for these acts of torture. And this has really helped in creating accountability for acts of torture and deterring officers from continuing with the vice. Now, previously, when we're just before Uganda domesticated the UN CAT, we used to use the principle of vicarious liability, where the master is liable for the acts of his servant. That means that the state was liable for the acts of its officers. And that is why Attorney General and Uganda at large was losing a lot of huge sums of money to try and compensate victims of torture. Now, when we bring into effect the PPTA, the law, then errant officers, private entities or officers will be privately prosecuted for the acts of torture that they commit. Now, it's very important because previously we saw that officers, when errant or had committed acts of torture, would just be transferred to other areas and they would not feel the pinch. Right now, the person who commits acts of torture is personally liable. And I think many police officers have lost their jobs. We have seen many taken to court for acts of torture because then it is a crime, it's a criminal law in Uganda. Now, taking them to a disciplinary committee may not be sufficient because we know that many times the bosses or officers, friends can cover up for others. However, if we make it criminal in nature, as we have it now, then we know that the specific officers will be held personally accountable. And that gives a sense of satisfaction to the victims. And we as a commission have been pushing for that. We're happy that it's that way.
But it's amazing because this has already been prescribed in the anti-torture laws of Uganda. that a police officer or any other government officer who commits the crime of torture has to be privately prosecuted. That's according to the law. But then let's talk about the issue of the local defense units beating up civilians as they try to enforce curfew guidelines set forth by the Ministry of Health and the President right there. Do you, as a Uganda Human Rights Commission, have any plans to prosecute these errant LDUs?
For any person who commits acts of torture, they commit a criminal offense. And that means whether it is the commission or courts of law, they have to be brought to book and justice has to prevail. In this case, whether it's an LDU or a military official or a private security guard or a police officer, as long as they commit acts of torture, whether during implementing curfew or during COVID-19 or during their course of business, they will be held personally accountable. However, there are situations where the victims do not know who the perpetrators are. Where that happens, we also bring the states to account. And that is where the principle of vicarious liability comes in, where the master, that is the state, is liable for the actions of the officers. And this is, for example, you're blindfolded. And you know, I have seen these persons, they're wearing UPDF uniforms, and I am taken to a place, God forbid, and stuff happens to you. You do not know who they are. You don't know their names. But everyone has seen the vehicle. It's a state vehicle. Everyone has seen a uniform. It's a state uniform. That way, we hold the state accountable for its errant officers. We may not be able to pinpoint the specific person. However, the state will still be held accountable for the acts of its officers. And so justice will prevail. And we see many of those cases ending up with the UHRC, and Attorney General or the different ministries have paid compensation to such cases.
International Day in support of victims of torture. Of course, we're expanding this conversation that is largely centered around the theme of speak out against torture during and after COVID-19. Now, if you have any submissions with regards to the conversation we are having here on NTV, please do call in. The phone lines are open. We shall sample some of those questions and my guests will actually submit those answers. Let's take a short break. We'll be right back with more information. Welcome back and thank you for keeping it NTV Uganda. We are still speaking about torture in all its forms, and we are calling on the public to please speak out against torture during and after COVID-19. Well, I do have my two panelists who with me have been expounding on this same issue. That is Ms. Ruth Sechindi. She's the Director of Monitoring and Inspections at Uganda Human Rights Commission. She's not alone. We also have Patience Katenda. She's a legal officer at Uganda Refugee Law Project. Now, let me come to you, Patience. Let's talk about what your organization is doing, Refugee Law Project, to protect survivors of torture.
Thank you very much. And in answering this question, allow me do it in a two-segment.
Please go ahead.
What we have been doing before the COVID pandemic and what we're actually doing during the COVID pandemic. So at the Refugee Law Project, we ensure that all our services, especially for torture survivors, but clients as a whole, is a holistic service. And at the center of providing a holistic service is ensuring that we also pay attention to what we call client-centeredness. So what would the client want? Because many a time, I as a legal officer may think court would be the best for this particular facts you've given me, but the client may have what they consider as justice in their own perspective. So we pay attention to those two notions. Now, before the COVID-19 pandemic, we operate under 5 thematic programs to ensure that our client gets a holistic service that I talked about. So in no particular order of importance, because we all work together as a whole to ensure that RLP at the end of the day stands as an institution, I'll start with the Access to Justice program. Under this program, if a client came to us presenting facts that depict torture, we will consider, do you want to go to court? Do we have everything in order? Can we take this matter to court? Because the law provides that we could take the matter to court or we could take the matter to the Uganda Human Rights Commission. So we will talk with the client through this. But also, if we decide to actually take that route, then we will have to look at investigations and documentation. Has this been done? Are our things in order? We would hate to have a case where we go to court and we are thrown out on a technicality. So we will usually do police follow-ups to ensure that investigation and documentation has been handled well. But we should also note that many a time, the perpetuators are actually the police themselves. So in those instances, it may be difficult or challenging to actually go to the same police to get the investigations done. So we will talk to the client about this to see what is the best way we can accord this. But then in addition to that, we acknowledge that us as RLP or the Refugee Law Project cannot do this alone.
Yes.
So we also partner with other institutions. And in these partnerships, we usually conduct what we call trainings for state and non-state actors. I talked about the importance of speaking the same language. So we will ensure, what does the police know about torture? How do they define torture? What does the army think? What does the judiciary think? What do the other entities think? So we will have trainings with these partners and ensure that at the end of the day, if a client came to the Refugee Law Project or the client went directly to the Uganda Human Rights Commission, what they receive is actually one and the same. In addition to that, I earlier spoke about our English for adults, and I acknowledge the fact that usually when refugees come into the country, they do not know how to interact with the nationals because they do not speak the languages. So through these classes, they are not only empowered to be able to speak with the nationals, but they can advocate for their own rights. So if they see a neighbor committing torture or perpetrating torture on another person, they are empowered to be able to go to the Uganda Human Rights Commission, to come to our offices, to go to court directly and simply state out what's happening. But then also these classes act as a therapeutic space for our clients. When they come to class, they interact with the learners. I'm sure all of us in studio can recall maybe that time in senior 2 or senior 3 when we got our first best friend, someone who would talk to easily, someone who would relate with. So our classes also provide that ambience for them. I'll quickly move to the next program, which is mental health and psychosocial well-being. Like the name of this program, it speaks to the inner person.
Right.
Even if we decided to take the matter to court, but you're not at peace internally, it wouldn't help. So it speaks to the inner man of each and every one of our clients. Because for someone to be fully rehabilitated from torture, many a time, the inner man is very crucial. It all starts with you. The famous saying that charity starts at home. So it starts with you. Are you willing to talk about what happened? Are you willing to actually become an advocate so that other people can see what you went through and pick a lesson or a leaf from you? So how do we do this? The mental health program does counseling, and this counseling is specialized. We have what we call individual counseling, especially for first timers. Then we have what we call family counseling, because several times if maybe a head of family has been tortured or a child has been tortured, they may not fully recover if their parents don't understand what is happening to them. And then we go on to what we call group counseling, because the effects of torture do not affect the human being as a one man, but they have the capability of springing onto the family, to the community, and if not addressed, can also become intergenerational. So we do that through that counseling. And then key to this program is what we call our support group models. Simply put, support groups are a collection of peers or persons who have undergone a similar situation or suffering. So they come together in a therapeutic space and talk about the challenges they have undergone, but then also learn from each other. How have you as a person been able to combat this? And then also it provides a space where you realize that, look, I am not alone, because healing from torture is oftentimes a very lonely journey. Very lonely and a very dark journey. So in these spaces, they're able to know that I am not alone. If patients can go through it and get better, so can I. I want to just highlight 2 particular support groups that are very interesting in line with this topic. We have a support group called a support group for torture survivors. And here they talk about the various forms of torture, and you'll be amazed at the steps these persons go through to heal. For instance, recently, just before the lockdown came, we had a client in this group who told us about the fact that she experienced mental torture. How? She was used as a mattress while rape was being committed onto her mother by her biological brother. Wow. So things like this, actually, that is the word, they wow you. But you'll be amazed at the leaps they take, at the strength they get. You'll be amazed to sit in this space. It actually makes me every day want to become a better advocate, knowing that the work I am doing doesn't affect just one person, but a community at large.
Let's talk about the laws that are helping you do your work. What are some of those international treaties and local laws that govern torture?
So starting from the international, the mother of all human rights law is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in this particular law, it was publicly proclaimed that all human beings are equal, irrespective of color, status, race, or whatever. And then they also mentioned in this law that torture is a human rights violation. Fast forward, in 1949, we have what we call the Geneva Conventions. And in particular, Common Article 3 directly, outrightly puts it out that torture cannot be tolerated. So fast forward in 1987 is when we have a particular law that speaks to torture in its entirety. The definition, the components, who can perpetrate it, who can be the possible victims, and other things like that. And this is the United Nations Convention Against Torture that we have repeatedly been referring to in this conversation. And then fast forward in 1998, the world publicly recognizes that torture can be so heinous a crime that it is capable of underlying the 3 most heinous crimes at the moment. And this is, it can constitute a genocide, it could constitute a war crime, but it should also constitute a crime against humanity. How? For instance, a genocide. Genocide simply is when particular persons in a community do not want a particular group, could be by tribe, could be ethnicity, it could be by religious or social affiliation. So if torture acts are perpetrated to ensure that there's a total wipeout of this particular class of persons, then torture can be used as a crime against, a genocide crime. Then, so after those international laws, we now have what we call the regional laws, because these were done at that level, and they encouraged every region or every continent to have laws that speak to their particular continent. So for the African continent, we have what we call the African Charter on Human and People Rights, promulgated in 1981. And then we also have the Ruben Island Guidelines. These, again, highlight what is in the international law, but akin to them is they direct the national states to have what is personal to them. So they direct Uganda to have laws that are passionate about Uganda as a system. And that is how we see other laws in Uganda being done. Case in point, our constitution, like Ruth stated, is the supreme law of the land. And in this constitution, it proclaims that torture is prohibited. It's an underogable right. We've had that conversation. And through the constitution, it mandates our legislature, which happens to be the Parliament of Uganda, to be able to make laws. So in 2012, we have our first ever law in specific to torture. This is a huge milestone for Uganda, because finally our courts can prosecute torture acts within the jurisdiction basing on our own law. So it makes it very easy to interpret and to understand what we are talking about.
And of course, I've taken a look at the contents of the Anti-Torture Law 2012, and I could tell you there's some measures in there that were highlighted that many people do not believe go far enough to eradicate the torture as a crime from our spaces right here. Now, we do have some phone calls. Would like to hear from the public. If you're there, please submit your questions. Ruth Sechindi and Patience Katenda will be more than glad to take on those questions. Like I was saying, Ruth Sechindi, we do have anti-torture laws, but then the question right now is, do they go far enough to eradicate torture in all its forms from our society?
Laws in themselves cannot eradicate torture. Laws in themselves cannot change attitude. Laws in themselves cannot change situations unless adequately implemented. So in 2012, we enacted this law, and Uganda, for the first time amongst the, for the first time we had a specific law that deals with torture. Previously, we were only quoting the Constitution and the UN Cut. Let's
talk about the effectiveness of the same law.
Yes, that's where I'm coming to. So because we have this law, then we are able to criminalize acts of torture. Now, but like you have said, the laws in themselves cannot eradicate torture in Uganda unless we have attitudinal change of our police officers, we have a change in policies, and a change in the way we think and do things. Now, on a daily basis, you look at what is happening in communities where there's mob justice and everyone is cheering on. You just realize that many people condone acts of torture, where even with mob justice, they're beating each other and cheering on without anyone taking a step aside to think, is this person really innocent? Did they do this? And you'd be amazed at the number of people who, despite the existence of the laws, actually condone acts of torture. That is why when they steal your car, the first thing you think about is, I wish I could take this person somewhere where he could be disciplined. So as a community, we have accepted acts of torture. We have condoned acts of torture.
Yeah. Ms. Ruth Sechindi, we do have a caller. Yes, a very good afternoon. You're live on NTV. Yes, caller, good afternoon. You're live on NTV.
Good afternoon to you.
Yes, sir. What is your submission? Your name first.
My question is, how do I see when those people are getting arrested? My name is Augustine Chambadi.
What was the question?
The question is, I wish those people could get us a number where we are able to report such cases.
Okay. Thank you very much. A toll-free number. Yeah. Expound on that and then we move forward.
Yes, like I said, that you'd be shocked at the number of people who condone acts of torture. And because there's a lot of condoning acts of torture, we realize that communities use them. And once, because these people come from the same violent society that we all come from, when acts of torture, when you give them a uniform and you give them power and a gun, you will realize that they will do exactly the way they were raised or what they think is right.
But Ms. Sechindi, before I interrogate you further, let's get this other phone call. Yes, a very good afternoon. Yes, you're live on NTV. What's your submission?
Good afternoon, how are you?
Good afternoon, sir. Your name and your submission?
My submission is, I'm called Esau from
Yes, turn the volume of your set and please go ahead.
Are you getting me?
Yes. Oh, we've actually lost him, but please call back. We shall get that question. But please stay away from your TV sets. Ruth Sechindi, let's continue.
Yes, where did I end? Okay, when we like I was saying, we have a very violent society where we condone acts of torture, and the people we recruit in our security agencies come from the same hostile communities or violent communities. And that is why we have been calling on security agencies, can we do a background check before we recruit particular persons?
So you're saying we have a society that condones torture?
Torture.
Is
violence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are there any, is there something within the law that actually offers a deterrent so that these police officers or any other officers do not do the same? But let's first get this call. Yes, a very good afternoon. You're live on NTV. You're live on NTV?
Yes, Romeo, how are you?
I'm okay. Good afternoon.
Now, I've listened to these ladies, and whatever they are telling us is different from the reality. I want to tell you that the impunity of these police officers, they are above the law. They don't care what you are saying now in the studios. Every torture is taking place. I'm looking at these two ladies. Whatever they are talking is nice to hear, but the reality is different.
Thank you very much, my brother.
You cannot touch these police officers and the armed officers beating people. Torture is taking place. LDUs are beating people. I want you to take enough time and do your research and see how many people are totally disabled during this COVID-19. People have been disabled completely. Their lives will not be the same again. What are you going to do?
Thank you very much, my brother.
I think you are basically looking at politics mainly, but you are forgetting other factors like land, such things. Please, you need to upgrade, you need to do more. I think you need also to go on ground. You guys, people are facing each other. LDU is like LDU. I don't know who's going to touch this LDU. For sure, people are being shot at. People are being beaten at. Please do enough research. You need to pull up yourself.
Well, thank you very much, sir, for that humble submission. Ms. Ruth Sechin, it seems like the public does concur with you when you say that some police officers or officials in the government are actually above the law. But we do have another phone call. Yes, hello, caller. A very good afternoon. You're live on NTV. Ms. Ruth Sechin, what is entailed within the law that can actually compel these officers to actually veer away from these acts of violence? I do understand. If you torture someone and you decapitate them, you can get some 15 years in jail or life imprisonment. And if it's not so, serious, if it's just a cruel way of degrading way of someone, you can get 7 years in prison. So the question we're asking, are these punishments deterrents, or do they go far enough to eradicate torture in all its forms?
Let me just correct something.
Yes.
No police officer or person is above the law.
Mm-hmm. But it seems like it, according to what we are seeing.
According to the law, no one is above the law. As everyone has to work and live within the law, because the rule of law operates in Uganda. Now, however, we have errant officers, and that's why I call them errant, because then their excesses, they go beyond what is required, the required norm. Now, the police has put in place measures, policies and guidelines that we have seen, and they even have a human rights directorate that deals with issues of human rights, particularly issues of torture. So the question is, why does it continue? Why are some people, why do they go off or veer off the track of what they know that they should be? And quite often they say they're always rotten tomatoes, but we're saying this cannot be justified, it has to stop. But back to the question that you raised, are the laws deterrent enough? Yes. What more deterrent can it be than you living in prison for the rest of your life? Because for aggravated torture, the maximum sentence is life imprisonment. And it means you will be in prison for life. And for where there's a violation of cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, we leave it to the discretion of the magistrate or judge to determine. Now, that is deterrent enough. The question is, if we have these stringent laws, why then do people continue torturing others? And that goes back to the recruitment part and the way we conduct our investigations. Because many officers or some police officers think that if I beat you, then you shall confess. Remember that one of the reasons why persons or suspects are tortured is to extract confessions or information out of them. So it's a quick way of getting information or solving cases. So we're saying, can you use scientific means? Use polygraphs, okay? Use lie detectors. Use sniffer dogs that are well trained. Equip and train your officers very well so that if there is arson, if there is murder, you can actually investigate thoroughly. But right now, you look at the scene of crime, sometimes it's not adequately handled. We're saying, can you have proper ways of investigating so that then you do not resort to torture? Because we know that one of the reasons that why people are tortured, it's because they want to extract confessions or get information. So we believe that the laws are sufficient and we don't need any other laws. Can we implement what we have to ensure that the vice of torture is kicked out?
Ms. Patience Katenda, do you believe the laws in the current form are sufficient enough to eradicate torture in all its forms? Keep in mind, 15 years if I decapitate someone's leg, arm, and they die. Actually, that is life imprisonment. If I decapitate your arm and you keep alive or you stay alive, that is 15 years. If I abuse you or mistreat you, that is 7 years or a fine of 3 million something shillings. Do you think such laws go far enough? She says, well, they're sufficient. But in your opinion, as Uganda Refugee Law Project, what do you make of all this as far as these stringent measures are concerned?
I actually agree with her in its entirety. The laws are sufficient as they are. And to answer that, and in line with the previous caller who said, the things are still ongoing on ground and we need to do much more. The answer is the laws are there. Yes, we definitely need to do much more. That's why we're here on this TV talk show today, to enlighten, to refresh our minds and to remember.
To remind the viewer of their rights.
Yes, and I also just want the viewers out there to know that even during this COVID-19 pandemic, we have cases ongoing in court, new cases that have been brought up specifically concerning torture. For instance, there's a case at Buganda Road court before the magistrate there, the chief magistrate there, Her Worship Miriam Ayoa Kelo. And this case came just right after our president came on air and said that the security personnel, especially the LDUs, were using excessive force in the enforcement of the COVID-19. So what happened is these two police officers are alleged to have beaten up a pregnant woman. And the good news is the response might be slow, but it's getting there. At least we have precedents, we have cases that are being handled. These people are currently in prison, and if you want to read up this matter, it's on every website as long as you have the internet.
These laws don't need to be amended to make them stronger. You believe they are actually strong in their current form?
As they are right now?
Okay.
Very well done.
Okay, let's talk about the procedure of reporting with Ms. Ruth Sechindi. Tell us about that reporting procedure. What are the likely interventions for survivors of torture?
Well, for the Uganda Human Rights Commission, we have many forms of reporting. We have reporting where you can walk into our offices.
Right.
And here we have 10 regional offices, 10 field offices, and the head office. So we have 23 offices around the country, whether it's Mbara, there's Fort Portal, Masaka, Jinja, Moroto, Gulu, Soroti, 10 regional offices and 10 field offices. We have toll-free lines where you can call and lodge a complaint. One of them is 0800 100 766. That is easy to get, the 0800 100 766. We also have Twitter accounts or Facebook accounts. That is for usually the youth who use that. They can lodge complaints there, and we address them now. The procedure upon lodging a complaint, usually we record a statement from you so that we know whether it's a human rights violation. Now, people from all walks of life come to us because there's free legal services, rightfully so. And then we also do a lot of referrals for particular cases that we do not handle. So we send some to Refugee Law Project, we send some to Urinate, we send some to courts of law, we send some to different institutions because different people need different services. Now, for those complaints that have human rights issues, we record their statements and we commence investigations. Every complaint that we receive is free of charge. We do not charge any amount of money. It is free of charge. We do the investigations. Our lawyers will attend to you. Our investigators will attend to you. And after investigating the cases, if it is a human rights violation and it's not torture, usually we mediate. There are cases, labor matters, we mediate. But those that are severe, that are very severe like torture, quite often they end up in the Human Rights Tribunal. You do not need a lawyer before the tribunal. However, our lawyers can guide you on how you appear before the tribunal, and then you get redress. That is the brief of the...
All right, ladies and gentlemen, you were quite wondering, is there a toll-free line we can use to call? Yes, 0800 100 766, 0800 100 766. That's the number you can reach, and you'll be able to get some help from the Uganda Human Rights Commission. Now, we are actually wrapping up the show. Let me task you, Patience Katenda, to let us in on some of those recommendations you think will help government to alleviate this problem moving forward.
One is continued sensitization.
All right.
The sensitization is taking place, but we need to make sure it goes to everywhere in the country, not to the elite only, but to all the villages. But then too, we see that even through our callers today, many of them are complaining about the security personnel. So the government should have trainings for these personnel for them to understand what is torture. And in instances where they have already been trained, let's have what we call refresher trainings. But then also copying from the model of the Refugee Law Project, we have something that we call the care for caregivers. So let's look into the needs of our security personnel. Many a times, of course, torture is not in any way justified or guaranteed, but many a times people react because of certain forces behind. If someone is hungry, for instance, it will become very difficult for them to handle you with a soft, with a soft hand. Often the English say an angry man. Sorry, a hungry man is an angry man, yes. So let's look at the care for caregivers. Bearing in mind there are things like vicarious trauma. If I came to you and told you a very traumatic story, chances are you would start to feel those effects and that kind of thing. So let's take care of our security personnel. But let's also bear in mind that torture is not only committed in the public or by public officials or by the security personnel, but let's also be keen to know that we have to be our neighbor's watch. We have to be our neighbor's eye and know that torture can be committed in the private as well.
Ms. Ruth Sechindi, recommendations for our dear government as we call it wraps.
I think we have to implement the Prevention and Prohibition of Torture Act. And not only through training, but through using science on how we investigate our cases, because most of the torture occurs during the investigative processes. Can we up our act and train our investigative officers on how adequately to train? Can we ensure that we do a background check on our officers so that if they have a violent background, they're not recruited in our forces because we know that they are going to be violent officers? Can we ensure that when we are training our officers, we train them on the laws that prohibit torture, so that I know that human rights is part of the curriculum. Can we emphasize that so that they come out a disciplined force? Those are some of the recommendations.
All right, ladies, this is what I've learned from this conversation. The laws that we have are sufficient enough, but the implementation is the only problem. You're still watching NTV. My name is Romeo Busika. I've also been here in studio with Patience Katenda. She's a legal officer at Uganda Refugee Law Project, and also Ms. Ruth Sechindi, the Director, Monitoring and Inspections at Uganda Human Rights Commission. And that's it for today. My name is Romeo Busika. I leave you with a message. Please speak out against torture during and after COVID-19. Everyone matters. Go out there and make it happen. Blessed afternoon. Good day.